places like Yellowstone or Yosemite as icons of American nationalism is this very same moment that the United States is segregating Native peoples on reservations, moving people off of their native lands and onto reservations.
America had its first national park, but for the main lobbying force behind it, Jay Cooke and the Northern Pacific Railroad, the sense of triumph was short-lived. In 1873, his finance company collapsed, triggering a nationwide financial panic. The United States plunged into years of economic depression, and construction of the railroad to Yellowstone ground to a halt.
In the 1870s, Yellowstone was a wilderness that was only lines on a map. It had no superintendent, no employees, no police force, and no way to reach it effectively.
This meant that fewer than 500 white tourists made it to the new park each year. And with no one to stop them, local Indians quietly continued to use Yellowstone in traditional ways. But the presence of any Indians in America's first national park would be short-lived.
"1877 is a pivotal year, both in terms of indigenous people and the national park idea. You have Yellowstone National Park that's been around now for, 5 years or so. And you have tourists visiting the park. And they're having an expectation that's not that different from tourists that visit the park today. They're going to explore, they're going to see the wonders, they're going to write home about them, and they're going to have a grand time. Okay? Meanwhile, the Nez Perce are fleeing the troops of General Miles.
The Nez Perce were an Indian tribe that lived hundreds of miles to the west of the park and did not consider Yellowstone part of their territory. When the US Army attempted to confine them to a reservation, the Nez Perce tried to escape to Canada. And by August 1877, had reached Yellowstone National Park.
By this time, the Nez Perce have been betrayed, they've been bloodied, the young men are angry, they have lost wives, they've lost children, they've lost sisters, and that there's part, particularly of the young men, who want to kill any white person that they meet.
So when the Nez Perce encountered some white tourists near the geysers, an altercation ensued. The tourists were briefly held captive, and one white man was shot and left for dead.
One group of pursuing Nez Perce went north to confront another tourist party that was camped on Otter Creek, and there they had a little skirmish. They shot Charles Kink and killed him, wounded Andrew Weichert, and scared the dickens out of the other people.
The Nez Perce hurried north out of the park, but were captured by the army just short of the Canadian border.
So that was the end of the Nez Perce campaign, but the local press out here in the West just went ballistic as far as these savages killing these tourists in Yellowstone.
The bad press was deeply troubling to the superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, Philetus Norris. Underfunded and understaffed, Norris now worried that tourists would stay away from Yellowstone. His fears deepened over the next 2 summers, as local Indian tribes also clashed with the US Army in the vicinity of the park.
And by 1879, if anyone has a sense of Yellowstone, it's where we have Indian wars every year. It's not a place for tourists. And so the management of the park becomes dedicated to protecting tourists and eliminating Indians from the park boundaries.
Norris organized for the removal of those Shoshone sheep-eaters who lingered in the park.
There is evidence that at some point they did get all of the sheep eaters kind of in one location and then get them onto a reservation.
Norris also tackled the other tribes who used the park seasonally, travelling at his own expense to neighbouring reservations to tell Indians to stay out of the park.
What happened when the Indian people all around, including my ancestors, when they were outlawed from going to the Yellowstone, it took away a great food source. And one of the sustaining factors of human life is to have a spiritual connection to our God. And the Yellowstone area, as it is known now, is a place where a lot of that strong connection was found.
Early park officials even rewrote history in an effort to allay the concerns of tourists. They spread a myth that Yellowstone's Indians had traditionally feared the geysers and avoided the very wonders that tourists wanted to see.
They were not afraid of the geyser itself. They didn't want to abuse the energy that was coming from those geysers and those steams and those areas, those hot areas. They didn't want to abuse it. It's part of their lives, and this is how we survived for a long time.
The enduring and pernicious aspect of the myth that Indians were afraid of the geysers and stayed away from Yellowstone is that it effectively erased the long indigenous history in the park. This helped to cement the notion that wilderness was and should be an uninhabited space.
I think this romantic idea of the wild as an unpeopled place was so powerful that whether or not Indian wars were taking place, whether or not national parks and Indian reservations were being created at the same time, there still would have been powerful cultural impulses to say, Indians don't belong in these national parks, let's have them be somewhere else.
The removal of Indians from Yellowstone created America's first uninhabited wilderness. It also set a precedent for the separation of native peoples from wild lands in the designation of subsequent national parks. And it entrenched the idea of wilderness as a tourist destination. After years of economic recession, construction of the railroad to Yellowstone finally resumed.
The Northern Pacific Railroad came to Yellowstone in 1883, and that was the shot in the arm that really kicked Yellowstone into gear for tourism. Suddenly, Yellowstone had 5,000 visitors instead of 500. Ladies stepped off the train, dressed up in their finery with parasols and tall boots, and gentlemen were wearing ties and